The Legacy Superhero Season 3, Episode 6, A Risky Rescue. Dad held the ransom note so tightly that his knuckles turned pure white. His hands shook, and he stared at the note so hard that he seemed to be trying to set it on fire through sheer force of will alone. "What do you think?" said Officer Henry, who rested his hands on his belt. Dad suddenly looked up at Officer Henry, a dazed look on his face. What do I think? I think I'm gonna go home, grab my shotgun, find out where this Holes guy is, and shoot him until he stops moving, and then shoot him some more. And if he lays even one finger on Mary's head, why, I'll... I know, Officer Henry interrupted. But as I already said, we don't know where he is. We could try calling that number and setting up a fake meeting, but Holes isn't going to listen to anyone who isn't Dad, I said. I bet if anyone other than Dad called that number, Holes would probably kill Mom outright. You shouldn't risk it. But Mary is in danger, said Dad. I have to save her, and I only have 24 hours to find her if this letter is accurate. We know, said Officer Henry. But Holes is a supervillain, and an incredibly dangerous one at that. It would be beyond foolish for you to confront Holes on your own. You have to let us find him while you... Why, what? Dad interrupted. He waved the note in Officer Henry's face. Sit around and wait while Holes does God knows what to Mary? Hope and pray that maybe you guys will be able to find him in 24 hours? Just twiddle my thumbs and hope that maniac decides out of the goodness of his heart to let Mary go? Officer Henry actually leaned back slightly at Dad's shouting, which was impressive, given how Officer Henry was younger and fitter than Dad. Mr. McDonald, we'll do whatever we can to find your wife, starting right away, but we need you to remain calm and not do anything impulsive. The last thing we need is for you to go after Holes and get yourself killed. You mean you think Holes is going to murder Mary anyway? Said Dad. That's not very reassuring. I didn't mean that, said Officer Henry quickly. I don't care what you meant, said Dad. He poked Officer Henry in the chest. If you don't save Mary right away, I grabbed Dad's forearm, causing Dad to look at me in surprise. Dad, please don't threaten Officer Henry. I know how you feel about Mom, but getting angry at Officer Henry won't solve anything. Dad continued to stare at me in surprise, which made sense, because I rarely challenged his authority or contradicted him on anything. But I knew that getting angry at Officer Henry wouldn't solve anything, especially because the police were in no position to find and save Mom at the moment. Besides, I was worried that Dad might let his anger get the best of him, and he might outright assault Officer Henry. That might have seemed a bit of a stretch, but Dad was incredibly protective of Mom and had a short temper. I knew for a fact that Dad could get violent when he lost control of his temper, having once seen Dad get into a fist fight with a cashier at a grocery store because the cashier treated Mom really disrespectfully. To my relief, Dad lowered his arm, but he didn't look very happy. He just looked at Officer Henry and said, "My apologies, officer. I lost control of my temper." "I understand," said Officer Henry, who sounded quite relieved that I had managed to de-escalate the situation. "If my wife was kidnapped, I'd probably feel the same way you do." "Right," said Dad. But then he leaned toward Officer Henry, a harsh expression on his face. "But I expect you to find and rescue Mary as soon as possible. Understood?" Officer Henry nodded quickly. "Completely, Mr. McDonald. We'll find and bring your wife back to you as soon as possible." Dad leaned back, though he still didn't look quite satisfied. "Thank you, officer. I wish you the best of luck." Then Dad nodded at me. "Come on, Jack. Let's go home. No point in sticking around here if Mary isn't here." "We'll call you if we have any luck finding your wife," said Officer Henry, "just to let you know." "All right," said Dad. Dad turned and walked toward the exit. I followed silently, hoping that Dad wasn't too angry at me for stopping him from picking a fight with Officer Henry. But perhaps I was getting worried for no reason because Dad seemed more depressed and frustrated than anything. The car ride home was very silent. Neither Dad nor I said anything. I figured Dad was probably lost in worry over Mom's well-being and safety. So was I, but I had other things on my mind as well, things I wasn't sure I could share with Dad just yet. For one, Hole's ransom note was still on my mind. Holes wanted my watch. Dad, of course, didn't have it, but I did. Even if Dad had agreed to Hole's demands, it would have become obvious that Dad did not have the watch. Therefore, even if Dad had gone to meet with Holes, the situation probably would have ended with Mom's death anyway, and likely Dad's too, given how Holes hated Grandfather and wanted to kill everyone related to him. But I hesitated to tell Dad that. For the past 3 months, I'd kept my secret identity as Trickshot, a secret from my parents. They were just as ignorant as everyone else about the true identity of the new Trickshot running around Rumsfeld. It had been tricky to do, of course, because I lived in the same house as my parents, but through a combination of skill and luck, I'd managed to avoid drawing their suspicion onto me. But I wasn't sure I could do that any longer. With Mom kidnapped and about to be killed in 24 hours, events seemed to be trying to force me to reveal my secret identity to Dad. If I did that, we might be able to put together a plan to save Mom. But I resisted the idea anyway, because I was worried about how Dad might react. It was no secret that Dad did not like Grandfather being a superhero. He had even explicitly told me and my late brother Thomas that he did not want us to become superheroes when we grew up. He didn't think much of the lifestyle because of how dangerous it was. If I'd told him that I had been doing superhero work behind his back illegally, he might very well disown me and kick me out of the house. Hell, he might even blame me for Mom's kidnapping. After all, if I hadn't started using the watch, Holes would never have come back to Rumsfeld seeking revenge. Yet I hated seeing Dad so sad, even depressed. Depressed was a word I had never used to describe Dad before, but it fit his current mood to a T right now. If I told him I was Trickshot, he might not be depressed anymore, though he'd probably get angry instead. And trust me, Dad's anger was not something you wanted to be on the receiving end of, as Officer Henry learned earlier. "TW," I said in my mind, "what do you think I should do?" "I can't tell you what to do," said TW. "Ultimately, whether you reveal your secret identity to your father is your choice, not mine." "You sure are helpful." "Sometimes I can be more helpful when I don't tell you what to do." That seemed like a cop-out to me, but at the same time, I knew that I couldn't make TW do anything. This decision really did fall on my shoulders, even though I wished it didn't. That meant I, and I alone, was responsible for making this decision, regardless of the consequences. I mean, I always knew that, but now it was starting to seem far more real than it did before. When we got home, we still didn't say much. Dad went into the kitchen and turned on the sink, and started washing dishes and putting the spaghetti away. My own bowl of half-eaten spaghetti was still on the table, but I wasn't in the mood to finish it, given everything that had just happened. Besides, I was too nervous trying to figure out whether to tell Dad I was Trickshot to eat. I covered my spaghetti with plastic wrap and put it in the fridge, intending to finish it later, though at the moment I didn't give much thought as to what later even meant at this point. Looking over at Dad, who was busily washing and drying the dishes, I said, "Hey, Dad, do you need any help with the dishes? I'm willing to help if you need it." Dad didn't even look at me. "Nah, Jack, I've got this. You can go to your room if you want, or go outside or whatever. I'll put away everything in the kitchen. Don't worry yourself." I bit my lower lip. I was very uncharacteristic of Dad to refuse my offer for help. He was usually enthusiastic if I offered to help with or do chores. That he didn't want me to help told me just what kind of state his mind was in, and was the motivation I needed to do what I needed to do, whatever the consequences may be. Taking a deep breath, I looked at Dad again and said, "Dad, I have something I need to tell you." Can it wait until later?" said Dad in an emotionless voice. "These dishes aren't going to wash themselves, and unless it's important—" I'm trick shot. The sound of shattering glass told me that Dad had accidentally broken one of the plates in the sink, but he apparently didn't care because he finally turned around to look at me, a dumbfounded look on his face. "What did you just say?" This was it. I could take back what I said and pretend I had meant to say something else, but there was no going back now. So I said, "You heard me, but I'll repeat it again anyway. I'm trick shot." Dad was silent for what felt like an eternity, staring at me with an expression I found hard to read. Though I wasn't sure how he was going to respond, I had a feeling that I should not have dropped this revelation on him so soon after Mom's kidnapping. I just hoped that he wouldn't get too angry at me for it. Finally, Dad said, "How long?" I blinked. "What?" "How long have you been trick shot?" said Dad. He looked and sounded calm, which was not what I had been expecting at all. 3 months, I said. Almost 4 at this point. Why?" Dad was silent for another moment, as if what I said was still sinking in. I see. I always suspected, but I never knew for sure." I looked at Dad in surprise. "You always suspected I was trick shot? Why?" "Because it made a lot of sense," said Dad. "I've never been a very deep or observant thinker or anything like that, but even I can put 2 and 2 together. I just found it odd that someone wearing the original trick shot costume would just show up out of nowhere exactly 10 years after my father's disappearance and start fighting crime again." "Yeah, but..." And, I didn't think anyone else would have the suit or the watch," Dad continued. "If there was one thing I knew, it was that when my father disappeared, he took the trick shot watch and the costume with him. Trust me, when your grandfather disappeared, I searched all of his belongings myself for the watch, but I never found it. And it made sense to me that if my father was still alive somewhere, then he would want to give the watch to one of his grandchildren if he absolutely had to give it up." While I never thought Dad was an idiot, I had not realized that he could make such simple but logical deductions based off available evidence. I guess doing all that work in the construction field didn't mean he couldn't use his brain. It made me wonder what other evidence Dad may have used to figure out who I was. "Well, you're absolutely right," I said. I held up my watch. "See this? This is the trick shot watch, the one that belonged to Grandfather. Right now it looks like an ordinary watch, but when I put on my costume, it looks like how it normally does." Dad nodded. I suspected as much. "You got it in the mail for your 16th birthday, didn't you?" Yeah," I said. How did you guess?" "Your mother told me about the package you got in the mail on your birthday," said Dad. "She said there was just a watch in it, and that she didn't know who sent it. I thought it might be the watch, but when I first saw you wearing it and noticed it didn't look like the trick shot watch, I just thought I'd made a mistake." "If you suspected this for so long, why didn't you tell me right away?" I said. "Why not confront me about it immediately?" "Because, like I said, I wasn't sure," said Dad. He wiped his hands with a dry wash rag, and honestly, I didn't want to believe that one of my sons was going behind my back to play superhero. Knowing you were a superhero, and an illegal one at that, meant knowing that you were putting your life in danger, if not every day, then at least on a regular basis. I didn't want to think about the danger you put yourself in, so I decided that you were just an ordinary teenage boy who happened to have a nifty watch." I stared at Dad, stunned to hear such a frank admission from him. I had never guessed that Dad would ever be too afraid to confront even the hardest truths. In the time I'd known him, Dad had always made it clear that he wouldn't put up with crap from anyone, and that he was willing to pursue the truth no matter how hard or unpleasant it may be. He had even explicitly taught me to always be honest and truthful, even if it was hard. To hear Dad admit that he, like myself, sometimes tried to ignore unpleasant truths actually made me respect him more, rather than less, than I had before. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," I said. I would have told you earlier, but I have a good reason for not telling you or Mom about my identity, though I guess it isn't good anymore now, given what I just told you." Dad nodded. "I'm not angry, but I am disappointed that you weren't honest with me up front. Still, I'll accept your apology anyway, because right now we have more important things to worry about than that." The saving Mom," I said, "right?" "Right," said Dad. "When I first read Hull's ransom note, I felt despair because I knew I didn't have the trick shot watch. But now that you have it—" "I don't want to give it up," I said. I covered the watch with my hand. "Not to Hull's anyway. He'll just kill all of us if I do that." Dad rubbed his forehead in frustration. "Jack, what is more important to you, that watch or your mother's very life?" "Mom's life," I said. "But it would still be stupid to give Hull's the watch. I'm the only one who can beat him, but if he has the watch, then all of Rumsfeld will be at his mercy, especially because Bugbite is still in the hospital." "And," said Dad, "I would sacrifice the entire city and everyone in it if it meant saving Mary's life. And I don't say that lightly, because I love Rumsfeld and the people who live in it almost as much as I love my own family." "I know, Dad," I said, "but we can't play Hull's game. He won't uphold his own end of the deal. He wants revenge for what Grandfather did to him, and he will do anything to get it." "But how can we save Mary and keep the watch out of his hands?" said Dad in despair. He rested his face in his hands. "Hull's is too strong. There's no way we can stop him on our own. Our only hope is to give him the watch and hope that he has enough honor in him to give us Mary back without a fight." I sympathized with Dad's feelings, but I still didn't want to make the trade. I wanted to save Mom, wanted to save her more than anything else in the world, but I didn't want to lose the trick-shot watch, which, while not as valuable as Mom's life, was still something I did not want falling into the hands of Hull's. I had to admit, however, that Hull's had us in a tricky spot. If we gave him the watch, we would be powerless to stop him from slaughtering us. And he would, I knew he would, because even though I didn't know Hull's myself, I knew that he was too obsessed with revenge against Trickshot to think rationally or behave honorably. This whole situation had the word trap written all over it in bright neon pink ink. Yet I could not see any way out of it. It didn't help that we had less than 24 hours to agree to Hull's demands before he killed Mom. That was when an idea occurred to me. It was a simple idea, one that might possibly help us, but it was also incredibly risky and had the potential to blow up in our faces if I didn't do it right. But it was also our best chance of saving Mom and stopping Hull's at the same time. So I said to Dad, "Dad, I've got a plan." "A plan?" Dad repeated, raising his face out of his hands to stare at me blankly. "What kind of plan?" "A plan that will let us save Mom without letting Hull's lay even one finger on the Trickshot watch," I said. "In fact, if it works, we might even be able to put Hull's back in prison, but we'll have to be smart about it. We can't just go charging in. And, in order for it to work, we'll have to do it without the help of the police, which will make it a lot more dangerous for us." Dad cracked a grin. "Sounds good to me. The police are useless anyway. The two of us ought to be more than enough to stop Hull's, and if Hull's does turn out to be tougher than we think, well, I'm sure we'll figure something out." "Good to hear," I said. "Now listen closely, because we have less than 24 hours to save Mom, and I don't want to waste a lot of time talking when we need to spend as much time as we can doing." 16 hours later. At midnight that night, I flew silently through the air and landed on top of the abandoned warehouse where the exchange between Dad and Hull's was to take place. I looked around briefly, searching for Hull's, but it seemed like I was alone up here, which was fine by me, because the last thing I needed was for Hull's to notice me. If he knew I was up here, then Hull's would either call off the exchange entirely, or maybe just kill Mom outright and run away. With luck, Hull's would only realize that he was about to be played when things had progressed too far for even him to fix. I walked over to the window on the roof and peered through it at the interior of the warehouse, and the warehouse was completely empty, which meant that Hull's was not here yet, though that wasn't surprising, because Hull's had indicated over the phone call with Dad that he wouldn't show up until Dad did. I suppose he just wanted to make sure that Dad would actually be here, instead of Dad sending police cops in his place instead. It was logical for him to do, but it did bother me a little, because it meant I'd have to time my intervention very carefully in order to make sure this plan went off without a hitch. TW flashed into existence next to me. His form glitched horribly for a brief second or two before he became solid again, though the edges of his holographic form were fuzzier than ever, and he still flickered a time or two. "Do you think this plan will work, Jack?" "It has to," I said as I rose to my full height and stretched my limbs, "because if it doesn't, Pols will kill Mom and probably Dad too." "I dislike the idea of putting Gregory's son in danger," said TW, folding his arms across his chest. His arms flickered and merged with each other before flickering again and becoming separate. "Unlike you, he doesn't have any powers that he could use to defend himself." I smiled. "Oh, don't worry too much about Dad. He might not be a superhero, but he's got the heart of one. Plus, he did say he was going to carry his handgun concealed on his person, even though I told him that Holes's powers basically make guns useless against him." "Your powers are not much more useful," said W. "We still don't have a real strategy against him. We don't even have the depower that Gregory used to beat him the first time. And of course, I'm still glitching out, so I don't know how much help I'll be in the final fight." "I'll figure something out," I said. "I already basically beat him the first time we met. I'm sure I can beat him again, especially if I get the drop on him." "Well, I hope you're right," said TW. He sighed. "And I suppose this is really our only option if we're going to stop Holes once and for all. I don't like it, but if this is what we have to do, then so be it." "Hey, I don't like it any more than you do," I said. "But, like you said, this is our only chance at beating him. We just have to pray and hope for the best." "My cynicism says that's naive," said TW. "But maybe that's just the glitch speaking." Probably," I said. "Anyway, you should stay in the watch for now to conserve your energy. Right now, I need to keep my wits about myself in case Holes has something up his sleeve that we're not aware of." TW nodded and disappeared with another flash. I knelt down before the window again, but due to the stillness of the night, my mind wandered a bit, and I reflected on the plan which Dad and I had hammered out several hours earlier, though it seemed more like a lifetime ago now, due to how tense and nervous I was. Several hours ago, Dad had called Holes as per the ransom note, and the two of them had agreed to meet in the warehouse district in eastern Rumsfield. Dad would bring the trick shot watch, and Holes would bring Mom, and the two of them would make the exchange inside the warehouse itself. Once the exchange was complete, Dad and Mom would be allowed to leave the warehouse unharmed, as would Holes. I doubted that part myself because there was no way that Holes would ever let the son of grandfather leave unharmed, but that was what they had agreed to over the phone, and it was what we all more or less expected to happen. Of course, Dad wasn't going to give Holes the trick shot watch. Dad was going to enter the warehouse with an empty box that he would try to give Holes in exchange for Mom, hoping that Holes might be so desperate for the watch that he might not even check the box to make sure the watch was actually in there. Even if Holes didn't take the box, I would break through the window and jump Holes before he even knew what was happening. Assuming all went well, in a few minutes, Mom would be safe, the trick shot watch would remain safely in my possession, and Holes would be back in prison again. But that was assuming everything went well, and I knew from experience that plans didn't always work out the way you want them to. There was always an element of uncertainty to even the best plans, and this was no different. Still, I had reason to believe that this plan would, more or less, work out the way I thought it would. As far as we knew, Holes still didn't know my real identity, and as long as he didn't know that, then he would never even suspect that we had laid a trap of our own for him to walk into. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out and saw that Dad was calling. Answering the phone, I said, "Hey, Dad, where are you?" "Just outside the warehouse," said Dad. "Still sitting in my car. Is Holes there yet?" I glanced through the window and shook my head. Nope. The warehouse looks pretty much entirely abandoned. I don't see anyone in there." "Are you sure he's going to show up?" said Dad in a worried tone. "I know he told me he would show up with Mary, but what if this is all a trap? He might just show up without her and kill me for being the son of the original trick shot." "Maybe, but I wouldn't worry about it if I were you," I said. "Holes wants the trick shot watch. I'm absolutely certain he'll show up and bring Mom with him, though I can't guarantee he won't try to kill you. But that's what I'm here for. If Holes decides to go back on his end of the deal, then I'll jump in and save you and Mom like we agreed." Right, I almost forgot you're there," said Dad. "Makes me feel better already, to be frank. But I'm still going to be cautious, and if that bastard lays even one finger on Mary's head, I'll introduce him to my good friend Samuel Colt. I think the two of them will get along great." "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that," I said. "Anyway, are you going to enter now?" "Yeah," said Dad. "And I'll call Holes to let him know, so don't worry about that. I still have that Jerk's number on my phone. Hopefully this will be the last time I ever have to dial it." "Hopefully," I agreed. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into the pocket of my suit. I then knelt in front of the window again, keeping as low as possible so that when Holes appeared, he would not see me. I doubted Holes would see me anyway, given how I was on the roof, and he didn't have any reason for looking up. But it was still best to be as still and quiet as possible in order to make sure he didn't notice me. A second or two later, I heard the faint sounds of rusty door hinges creaking as a door was opened and closed. Another instant, and Dad walked slowly into view, the empty cardboard box in one hand, his cell phone in the other. He was talking into his phone, most likely to Holes, though thanks to the glass I was unable to hear anything Dad said. I couldn't even see his face, because I was looking directly down at him and could only really see the top of his head. Dad himself, on the other hand, was looking this way and that as he walked. I didn't blame him. The warehouse was pitch black inside, which would give Holes plenty of places in which to hide. I could tell that Dad was worried that Holes might jump him, but my night vision goggles showed me that the warehouse was still empty, so Dad really didn't have anything to worry about right now. Then Dad lowered his smartphone to his side and slipped it back into his pocket. Just as he did that, a large black hole appeared on the other side of the warehouse, and Holes himself stepped out of it. He was not alone. He dragged Mom out of the hole behind him. I was disgusted to see that he had tied up Mom and stuffed a sock in her mouth to keep her from speaking. She didn't look injured from what I could tell that Mom was absolutely terrified. She was shaking like she was having a stroke, and I worried that she might just have a heart attack outright if she became too afraid. With Holes now here, I cracked open the window just enough for me to be able to hear whatever they were saying below. I got close to the crack, putting my ear as near it as possible to make sure I didn't miss a single word of Dad and Holes' conversation. "Mary," said Dad, as soon as he spotted Holes and Mom. He took a step forward. "Mary, Josue pointed a gun at the side of Mom's head. "Oh, Walter, you like to, take one step closer and, you know what I'll do to your wife's pretty little head." Mom moaned through her sock. I could tell she was looking at Dad, desperately trying to convince him to run away, but Dad didn't run. He just stayed where he was, his grip on the box tightening. "Wise man," said Holes, though he didn't lower the gun from the side of Mom's head. I really don't want to hurt your wife. She's not related by blood to Gregory. Killing her would not sate my desire for revenge, so I am hoping that you and I will be able to behave like rational adults and make the exchange without any needless drama or problems." I found Holes' insistence on behaving like rational adults hilarious, given the circumstances, but I kept my mouth shut and listened as closely as I could. "Right," said Dad. He lifted the box. "This is it. Had to dig it out of the attic, but here it is. The Trick Shot watch. Originally owned by my father, just as you requested." "Ah, wonderful," said Holes. He nodded at Dad. "Come closer so I can get a better look at it." "First, give me Mary," said Dad. "Then you can look inside the box as much as you want." Holes tilted his head to the side, either in confusion or amusement. It was hard to say, because he technically didn't have a face. "You've got a bit of a sharp tongue there, Walter. Much like your father, only your father usually followed it up with a punch to the face. A powerless civilian like you is in no position to make demands of me." "But you want the watch, don't you?" said Dad, waving the box at him. "I won't give it to you unless you first give me my wife back." Holes suddenly threw the gun away into the darkness of the warehouse. At first, I thought he was going to let Mom go, but then Holes snapped his fingers and a hole appeared in the air next to Mom's head. He then forced Mom's head inside the hole, and Mom's head reappeared in another hole on his left side. "Mary," said Dad. He glared at Holes. "Don't you dare." Mom was whimpering through the gag in her mouth, but Holes held her steady with a strong grip. "Call me whatever names you like. It doesn't change the fact that I can behead your wife any time I like, and because you're alone, you wouldn't last very long against me in a fight either. Trust me, I don't value the watch so much that I would let myself walk into such an obvious trap." My hands balled into fists. I considered jumping down then and there, but the time wasn't right yet. If I tried jumping down there now, I'd just as likely get Mom killed as I would defeat Holes. But I could sense that the time to strike was getting closer and closer. I just needed to wait for it. Dad's hands shook. I thought he was just going to throw the empty box at Holes, but instead, Dad nodded. "Huh, okay, I'll give you the box." Dad lifted a foot to take a step toward Holes, but Holes shook his head and said, Walter, there's no need for you to walk all the way over to me. Here, I'll make a hole you can use." Holes pulled Mom's head out of the hole. A second later, 2 more holes appeared on the ground, roughly about the same size as the box. One of the holes was in front of Dad, while the other was in front of Holes himself. "Just drop the box into that hole and it will pop out of this one," said Holes, gesturing at the hole in front of himself. "It's quite simple." Dad bit his lower lip, but he nonetheless bent over and slipped the box gently into the hole. The box disappeared briefly before it popped out of the hole in front of Holes, landing before Holes' feet. Holes waved his hand, and the box fell into another hole, only to reappear in a hole about a foot above Holes. The box fell into Holes' outstretched hand, which he clutched against his chest like it was his firstborn. "There," said Dad, "you've got the box. Now give Mary back to me. Give her back now." Holes looked the box over as if he had not heard Dad's words. Then he looked up at Dad and said, "Very well, have at her." Holes shoved Mom forward. Mom fell toward the floor, but before she hit it, a deep black hole appeared underneath her, and she fell into it. "Mary!" Dad yelled. "No. What did you do with her?" Holes pointed toward the ceiling. "Look up." Another black hole appeared on the ceiling of the warehouse, not too far from where I was, and Mom fell out of it, toward the floor below, her eyes wide with fear and muffled screams escaping her gagged mouth as she plunged to her doom. The end of the Legacy Superhero Season 3, Episode 6, A Risky Rescue.